Hello everyone and welcome to the live stream from me, the critical care practitioner. It's great to have you here, 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. I know a lot of you are probably on days off in order to actually be here, so it's great to see you and I hope you find these sessions helpful. My plan is to be doing these regularly from now on. One of the main reasons is that I also produce podcasts and blog posts, so I don't see any reason why I can't combine the three. So this is kind of what I'm aiming to do here. So once a week, probably on a Friday at 2 o'clock. I'd kind of protected Fridays, so hopefully that means that I can do that fairly regularly. So I also wanted to take chance to point out some of my other resources, which are there. Yes, I'm pointing in the right direction. Just to let you know if you've not come across them before. So we've got the Critical Care Practitioner podcast. We've got my blog post, which is criticalcarepractitioner.co.uk. And I've also got a teaching site. There's some resources on there at criticalcarepractitioner.podia.com, which you can also find from the website. And if you want to get in touch with me, one of the easiest ways of getting in touch with me for those Twitter users is to find me at CC Practitioner. I tend to pick up those messages fairly quickly, so hopefully I'll be able to keep in touch with you. I'm also currently have a Facebook page, which is Critical Care Practitioner, but I'm actually converting that into a Facebook group as well. And one of the reasons I'm doing that is because I want to be able to create some interaction between the actual members of the critical care community. So I don't want it just me talking to you. I'd like you to be talking to me and you to be talking to each other, which is why I've set up the Critical Care Skills with the Critical Care Practitioner Facebook group. I've made the title a little long-winded, I know. I may have to change that in the future. But if you want to go and join us over there, just ask to join. As soon as I see them, I click in, it asks you a few questions, none of which you need to answer, but it's for my own purpose really. I ask, what do you want to most learn about? So I know that I'm trying to teach people the stuff that they actually want to know. So hopefully you will find that useful. So go over there and have a look, or go and subscribe to the other Facebook page, or go and subscribe to my podcast, for example. So this will be repeated on there as well. So if you are listening on the podcast, this is being recorded live on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Twitch, and hopefully eventually LinkedIn. This is being recorded live, and then it's going to be released as a podcast. So I'm trying to keep the visual references down to a minimum, but it's going to be difficult not to all of the time. So if you want to see it, come and join me on Facebook and all the other channels at 2 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. If you are watching live and you want any questions, just pop them into the chat. I'll have a look at them at the end. I won't do it while I'm talking to you because I just think it interrupts the flow a little bit. But if you've got any questions or any comments, if you think I'm talking rubbish or if you think I'm fabulous, please make a comment either way, because then it can help me improve the actual project. So what are we talking about this week? Well, we are talking about Peep. So positive end expiratory pressure. So we're going to talk about what it is, why we need it, when do we apply it, and the pros and cons of Peep. And there are a few, so it's important to know. So Peep, positive end expiratory pressure. So it's like it sounds. It's a pressure we apply to the patient's lungs at the end of expiration. So as they breathe out, at the end of that breath, we leave in so many centimeters of pressure at the end of that breath. Traditionally, we always leave about 5 centimeters of pressure, and I'll talk about the different ranges a little bit later, but we almost always leave 5 centimeters of pressure. There are some exceptions, but pretty standard 5 centimeters of pressure. And what that does is it helps keep the alveoli open at the end of expiration. Not completely open, but just a little bit more open than they otherwise would be if we didn't apply that pressure. So why do we need Peep? Why do we need to apply that to our patients? The main reason is to prevent something called atelectasis. Now, atelectasis is basically collapse of those alveoli. And if we can prevent or reduce the atelectasis, then we can improve the oxygenation of the patient. There's 3 types of atelectasis, which commonly the ventilated patient is prone to. So there's 3 mechanisms. So the first one is compression. So this is where there's compression of the lung tissue, and that's due mainly to the weight of the heavy lung during illness. So these lungs, when people become unwell, they fill with fluid, they fill with pneumonic changes, pus, sputum, and they get consequently heavier. So if they're lying on their back, the weight of that lung gradually gets heavier, it goes towards the back and starts to press on those alveoli. So that's compressive atelectasis, and it's something that a lot of the COVID patients or the ARDS patients are very, very prone to. You've also got resorptive atelectasis. Now, what does that mean? Well, that's really where there's been absorption of the alveolar air in the alveoli, mainly due to blockage of the airways a bit further up. So what's happened is that something that's blocked the air getting into the alveoli, be it sputum, usually, plugged it off, which means that there's nothing coming in or out of that alveoli, and over time, gradually, all the air that's in the alveoli is just reabsorbed into the body, so gradually that alveoli will collapse. And then finally, we've got impaired pulmonary surfactant production or function. Now, if we just quickly go over to the screen here, you can see the structure of the alveoli here. So we've got two types of cells around the walls of the alveoli mainly. So we've got type 1 cells and type 2 cells. Now the type 1 cells are the very flat cells that form the membrane of the alveoli, but the type 2 cells are those cells which actually produce surfactant. And surfactant is a substance that stops the alveoli from collapsing, being so ready to collapse. It's all to do with the surface tension, which I'm not going to go into now. But if those surfactant start to become damaged, which commonly happens during lung injury for lots of different reasons, that the type 2 cells become damaged, they stop producing surfactant or as much surfactant, and those alveoli are consequently more prone to collapse. So that's why we need to introduce Peep to our patients. So we increase oxygenation by increasing Peep. There are some problems with Peep though. Now, if you think in normal respiratory physiology, our respiratory system works as a negative pressure system, okay? So when the diaphragm pushes down during inspiration, negative pressure in the pleural cavity is generated, and that creates negative pressure in the airways that literally suck air into the lungs. So your diaphragm moves down, your rib cage moves up, creating this negative pressure which literally sucks air into your lungs and into your alveoli. And this causes a negative intrathoracic pressure. This negative intrathoracic pressure actually decreases pressure in the right atrium as well, because this kind of squeezes the right atrium, if you like, and this generates a sucking effect on the in the IVC, which then increases venous return. So this actually helps in our circulation as well, this negative intrathoracic pressure. Now, the application of extrinsic Peep, i.e. the Peep that we're applying to the patient, changes this physiology. So the positive pressure generated by the ventilator, because the ventilator is now pushing air in under positive pressure, which is why we call it positive pressure ventilation. We're no longer sucking air in through a negative pressure, we're pushing air in through a positive pressure. And this transmits to the upper airways and finally to the alveoli, which are transmitted to the alveolar space and thoracic cavity, and this creates positive pressure in those alveoli, or at the least a less negative pressure, and this increases right atrial pressure and decreases venous return. So if you give a patient too much Peep, you are at the risk of actually causing them some problems with their cardiac output. So we do have to be careful, and often our patients are on vasopressors anyway, aren't they? Because they have circulatory problems through shock, for example. But if you're going to give them too much Peep, you have to be aware that you may be compromising their cardiac output, for example. There is also something called intrinsic or auto PEEP. You may have heard this term, and this is a complication of mechanically ventilated patients. Usually, passive exhalation will permit complete emptying of the air in the lungs until lung pressure is equalised with atmospheric pressure. So as the ventilator valves changes direction and allows the air to passively escape, then that air can escape and the pressures are equalised between inside and outside. But in some cases, and I'm not going to go into the lots of reasons why this might happen, I think this might be for a future lecture. I didn't want, this is Friday 15 minutes and I could go on for about 2 hours about PEEP. But I think in Friday 15 minutes, let's just stick with this topic and we could perhaps cover it later. So in some cases, the lungs may not completely deflate, which leaves air trapped inside the lung at the end of exhalation, which generates a positive pressure that remains in the lungs. And this pressure is called auto or intrinsic PEEP. The problem with this is when this process repeatedly happens with each respiratory cycle, the amount of air trapping increases with each breath, and consequently the intrathoracic pressure increases. Let's just talk about what some of the research actually says. Let me change my screen so you can have a look at me in all my glory. So let's talk about what the research says. So I picked out a number of research articles. So the first one was one called Driving Pressure and Survival in the Acute Respiratory Distress Syndrome. And this is within the New England Journal of Medicine. All of these links are on the blog post. So if you go to criticalcarepractitioner.co.uk and look for PEEP, you'll see a blog post there. And I've put all the links in the bottom of the blog post there. So this paper really wanted to decide on the relative importance of things like lower end inspiratory airway pressures, lower tidal volumes, and higher positive end expiratory pressures, or PEEP, which are thought to be able to improve the survival in patients with the acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS. And they wanted really to find out what was the most important of these, which made the biggest difference. They used multi-level mediation analysis and analysed 3,562 patients with ARDS enrolled in 9 trials. And basically what they found was that it was actually delta P was the variable that was most important. What's delta P, I hear you say? Okay, so delta P, delta just stands for changing. Okay, so it's often written as a triangle, delta P changing something. Delta P is, sorry, delta changing something, delta P changing pressure. So if you think if somebody's got a PEEP pressure of 5 and pressure support or pressure control, my light's just gone. Only on a live stream would my light decide to give up, so I've gone dark, but you can still hear me hopefully. Yes please. Yeah, great. So where was I? I've lost my thread. Okay, so you've got a PEEP of 5 and a pressure control of 20. So your change in pressure between the two is 15 centimeters. Okay, so you've got a delta P of 15. Now they found that if you started to increase the PEEP to say 5 or 10, that actually made it slightly worse if you didn't increase the top pressure, because now your delta P is only 10, for example. So the change in pressure has got smaller, which they found to be problematic. And there are some studies that say we should be using higher PEEP pressures. But there's also a great concern that you don't want to increase the patient's peak pressure beyond 30 centimeters of water. There have been studies that have done that shows going beyond that starts to cause more harm than good. Another article is called The Effect of Lung Recruitment and Titration, PEEP versus low PEEP on mortality in patients with ARDS. Thank you, my director has just provided me with more light. Thank you very much. So this was a randomized trial of just over 1,000 patients, and they found that 28-day mortality was significantly higher among patients treated with a strategy of lung recruitment and PEEP titration than those treated with, they speculated that 28 day, this was their This was their theory, if you like, or their hypothesis. They found that they hypothesized that 28-day mortality was significantly higher among patients treated with a strategy of lung recruitment and PEEP titration than those treated with a conventional low PEEP strategy. So what they essentially said is that titrating PEEP is probably a better approach on the lower end than on the higher end. The American Thoracic Society also thought that the alveolar filling processes, when used in alveolar filling processes such as ARDS, it increases lung volume and helps the recruitment. However, when used in lobar pneumonia, it can cause alveolar overdistension in normal parts. So they were very much of the view that if the lung damage is almost throughout, it does help increase lung volume and helps recruitment. But if the lung damage is only in lobes of the lung, for example, it can cause alveolar overdistension in the normal parts. And the other thing that it does is that it diverts the blood supply away from the normal parts to the less healthy parts, and then you start to create a shunt as well as increasing intrathoracic pressure. Okay, so that's very quick on PEEP. I want it to be a Friday 15 minutes. Just bear with me while I change my screen in case there are any questions. I hope there are. I'm not saying I can answer them, but I'm hoping there might be. There aren't at the moment. Adam, thanks for joining me. I'm very well, thank you. So if there's no questions, like I say, go to, let me just get my other screen up. This will get better as I get better at this. This is very much a first for me. So if there aren't any questions, please go to my website, which is criticalcarepractitioner.co.uk. The post is on there. The links are on there. You can get hold of me at Critical Care Practitioner on Twitter. Let others know if you found it helpful. I'll be here at 2 p.m. every Friday, hopefully. Disasters like lights blowing apart. Let me know what topics you want as well. I will try and cover them. I will try and cover them as best I can. I don't know everything, of course I don't, but if you give me enough notice, I will try and find out for you the relevant information and details. Next week, 2 p.m, peak and plateau pressures. So I hope you found this useful, and I'll speak to you next week.